How much do you need to run? Are junk miles a thing? Should you do more easy runs or intensity? That's what we're going to talk about today as we take on one of the controversial topics, which is mileage and easy runs and volume. So let's start with this. Let's start with some research that I tweeted out that came out recently and looked at over 100,000 Strava users or runners. And they looked at marathon times and then the volume of training and then the differences in their zone 1, 2, 3 in a 3-zone system. And what they found is that the main differentiator was how much volume and easy running they were doing. So when you looked at sub 230 marathoners, they were 120 kilometers plus a week. If you looked at 230 to 3-hour marathoners, they were 80 to 100 kilometers a week. And then it just goes down and down. 3 to 3.5 hours, 60 kilometers a week. 3.5 to 4, about 50 kilometers a week. All the way down to, 4.5 hour plus is 30 kilometers a week plus. So you can convert that to miles, but once you get past about, 3 hours plus, they're not running that much, right? 60 kilometers a week, a little more than 40 miles a week, roughly. My conversion is right. Like that's how much I do fooling around and running with my daughter in a stroller, right? I'm not training for anything. I'm running 40 miles a week to stay fit. Now, I get it. It's recreational athletes. But the point is this, is we know volume is probably a limiting factor with these athletes. And 3 to 3.5 hour marathon is not that slow, right? It's a respectable time, especially if you have a, family, job, all that stuff. It's pretty good. But what this tells us is that obviously higher level athletes, even, those with families and jobs who are running 240 or what have you, are still running higher volumes. Now that doesn't answer the question on how much you should run, but it hints at that volume makes a big difference. Now, one of the reasons why we get this wrong is if you look at research and interventions, especially from health influencers who tweet about high intensity stuff, what they look at is they look at a bunch of short-term studies that shows increases in performance in VO2 max over 6 to 8 weeks, and they say, oh, high intensity interval training works better. There was another recent review that evaluated a whole bunch of studies, and it found that if we looked at longer term studies on volume, then if we just looked at VO2 max, one thing is that it has about the same improvement total as the intense work. It just takes longer to get there. So if you compared HIIT training at 6 weeks versus volume training at 12 weeks, they get to about the same spot. And the intensity training increases and then levels off. The volume training increases at a slower rate, but is slow and steady and keeps going. And we know this not just from the research, but if we look at the history of training. So I did a video on this, so go watch that if you want to go deep. But in brief, for a long period, we didn't do much volume in the early 1900s. Some did, but mostly not. And then we bounced back and forth between volume and intensity until at some point we realized, hey, there has to be a baseline of volume in order to improve, in order to maximize our performance. Now we periodize that, have certain periods with higher and certain periods of lower volume, but we need that aerobic foundation or aerobic base. And if we don't have that, our performance will plateau earlier. The reason why, if we look at the physiology of it, is something I alluded to earlier in that review. Easy running or accumulate volume is the slow road to performance improvement. Why? It takes longer amounts of time to get the adaptations. You need a steady, slow, gradual kind of pressure on the system to improve. So we can look at it from terms of mitochondria creation and efficiency. We can look at capillarization in the muscle. We can look at central components to adaptations to the heart. Okay, we can look at adaptations to efficiency and running economy. And what research tends to show us, and what practice confirms, is it takes longer to maximize those benefits. We need an accumulated load for a really long time. Part of the reason why is because a lot of these are structural, mitochondrial creation, slow twitch muscle fiber improvement, etc. And it just takes longer. But there's good news. Because it takes longer, generally if you maintain it with a reduced volume, it takes longer to lose that to a large degree. And this is what we see when we look at research on performance and all sorts of stuff. Tying back in the history one more time is if we look at coaches like Arthur Lydiard, Ernst van Aken, even Emil Zatopek, the runner, what we saw is a revolution in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that showed us we need a decent amount of volume. Lydiard was famous for being a milkman who then experimented with training on himself and experimented with relatively low, all the way up to 200-ish miles a week. Found out that was too much, but settled into a happy medium where he said, hey, we need 80, 90, 100-mile weeks in order to maximize performance. And his athletes did well. Now let's get into the details. We've explained why it's important. I want to go into a little bit of details of how we know this, and then whether that sweet spot is 100 miles a week like Lydiard or more variable. And hint, it's more variable. We'll go into that. So first off, a couple of the research studies that I want to give to back this up. So a lot of it was conducted by Jack Daniels, Dave Costal, some of the OGs of exercise physiology, where they were experimenting with athletes on volume of training. Costal famously took some relatively elite athletes who had 6 months off and then increased their volume and tracked measures like VO2 max and other physiological markers as they increased their volume again. And what he found is that VO2 max kept increasing all the way to 100 miles a week. And then as they increased all the way to 200 miles a week, there was no further improvement in that parameter. Gives some evidence towards, the Lydiard theory, right? There is a ceiling, at least for VO2 max, but there's a ceiling to performance as well. So it's not just accumulate more and more and see what we get. More recent research kind of confirms this. So there was some wonderful studies out of Europe that looked at both elite world-class athletes and then world-class East Africans, comparing them to a European class or national class European athletes. And what they found is in the separate studies, but in one of them, when they looked at world-class athletes, when you looked at what predicted performance and predicted performance improvement, it was, number one, volume of training had the best thing, and volume of easy running. After that, there was correlations with short intervals and tempo runs, but less so than volume and easy run volume. If you looked at comparison between European national class athletes versus elite East Africans, what were the biggest differentiators? Volume of training, easy training, and then it went tempo runs, and then short intervals. So again, we look at accumulated volume and easy running as the biggest differentiators or predictors of performance. So more evidence that tells us at the highest level, we need to accumulate enough volume to perform at a decent level. Now, I want to be clear here. Most of this research is in, distance athletes. So 5K up to marathon. Still applies to a degree with middle distance athletes, but the more we move down to the 800, there's more trade-off between volume and intensity. Okay? So let's go into what this all means. First off, it means anyone who tells you that, you don't need volume, they're lying to you. You need a decent amount. Now, what is a decent amount? it depends on the individual, their level of development, and the event they are training for. Okay, so if we're talking about a marathon, that volume requirement is increased because why? We need adaptations that help us, sustain for 2 hours plus, at a high intensity. Volume matters more than if I'm a 1500 runner. So we look at the marathon, generally at the elite level, the minimum, there are exceptions, but the minimum is peaking out somewhere 80, 90 miles a week. Most elite marathoners are around 100. Some go up much higher, but in that general ballpark. We're talking both men and women. Okay? That's just what the data tells us. Again, you can get away with less, but generally you're not running a marathon at an elite level or maximizing your performance off 50 miles a week. It's just not happening. Okay? You can complete one, you can run pretty well, but you're not coming near to your maximum performance. The volume requirement is higher. If we go down to 5K, there's more variation. But even there, at the elite level, most elite 5K runners are running somewhere between, 70 plus to 100 plus miles a week. Varies a bit. But the low end is still near 70 miles a week. And that's low. Okay? Very few to none elite 5K, 10K athletes are running 40, 50 miles a week. Okay. Why? Because it takes an accumulated load to get some of those adaptations. And then secondarily, we need the load to make us resilient and adaptable and recoverable. Because aerobic ability impacts our ability to bounce back and recover from things. So it allows us to handle more of the high intensity work or more of the tempo work or interval training that we need to do. We can bounce back, we recover quicker between intervals and sets. It all aids everything. Okay. What does this mean at the recreational level? Or the novice or intermediate or semi-elite level? What it often means is that you're not hitting the volumes to maximize performance. And that's understandable because there are life constraints that often get in the way. So you can't do, doubles every day or most days or even any days, for example, if you have life getting in the way. That's understandable. You have other stressors which increase, injury rates because you have to deal with stress of life, stress of work, which can lead to overtraining and injury because you're adding a stress of training on top of that. All understandable. But the point here is this. If you're a recreational athlete training for the marathon or even a half marathon at 40 miles a week, your biggest bang for your buck probably comes from accumulating more volume. Now, if you can't do this in running or have injury history or what have you, then you can supplement with cross training, biking, elliptical, swimming, whatever you want to use in there to get some of, not the exact, but many of the aerobic adaptations. And that's why it comes back to, I said the event determines things, but so does the individual level. So the way I look at volume for events and individuals is I look at, okay, what's the event you're targeting? And then you as an individual, what are your strengths and weaknesses? So do you come at it more from a speed orientation or likely more fast twitch side? Or more slow twitch endurance orientation? So for instance, let's take the 5K. Is my strength that I have a really good mile or 1500 and I'm just trying to extend that a little bit? If you're coming from the speed side, your volume requirements are probably a little bit less. If you're coming from the endurance side, they're probably a little bit higher because you need to maximize that strength. Okay? Same goes for the other events. Other individual characteristics include their injury history. Where's the weak link in the biomechanical chain? Is it sustained repeated load? Can we do anything from a strength training standpoint to bolster our chassis to handle that? Or are we relatively resilient and can handle a decent amount of volume? That determines things. That also determines our percent of volume that comes from maybe running and cross training. Okay. And then I think the other thing from an individual standpoint is your life, work, family constraints. How much time do you have a day? This is what constrains my volume, right? I have less than an hour a day. Most of it is pushing my daughter in a stroller. So my volume stays around 40 miles a week because I'm running, 7 miles ish a day in that time period. Sometimes workouts, but that are a little less volume. But that's kind of it. That works in my life. That's totally fine. But I'm not going to run my best marathon on that volume. But I have to accept that if I ever wanted to run a marathon. That's fine. It works in my constraints. So what does this all mean? When it comes to mileage, it's kind of in vogue to say like, it's overrated. Don't worry about the long run, which we covered earlier. The long run has its place. Mileage is foundational for anything basically 1500 and up. 800, you can get away with less. 1500, you can get away with less. But even the lower mileage athletes, like the historical Sebcos of the world, still, ran 60, 70 miles a week, if not more on occasion. You've got to get in the accumulated training load. It's just part of it. A lot of that, again, comes back to how to do it safely and well. So let's go over that real quick. First off, there's the 10% rule. Never increase your volume by more than 10%. It's a good rule of thumb sometimes, but I think it kind of sucks for some people because it'll take you forever if you're coming from 25 miles a week to only go 10% all the time. And for some people, they need that gradual increase. But there's a big difference between, going from 25 miles a week to 30 and, 60 miles a week to almost 70, for example. I know the math doesn't quite come out to 10%, but you get the idea. I like to think of it more like this, okay? I want to increase my volume up to what I have safely sustained for a long period of time. So if I've sustained 40 miles a week for a long time, I can increase to that relatively quickly. The main indicator is when we're increasing mileage to somewhere new we haven't gone before, it's just be gradual. Listen to your body. If some aches or pains or whatever come up, just pull back. The second thing is I like slight down weeks to absorb, but I'm a fan of not peak weeks, but what can I sustainably hold? So I'd rather have you sustainably hold 60 miles a week for 4 weeks than say, hey, I'm going to hit 80 and then I'm going to drop back down for a while because I'm can't handle it. I don't like scheduling in down weeks. I like to save them for when I kind of need them. So if it's once every 4 weeks, every 5 weeks, every 3 weeks, every 6 weeks, it just kind of depends on what your body takes. All right. So there's a little bit, the last part I'll say is how do we increase mileage? I like to add it to easy runs first and not the hard days because the hard days are already accumulating volume. All right. So we've given a lot here. I've given a lot. The bottom line is volume is your friend. If you can't increase it, I understand it because of time constraints. If you have a long history of injuries, I get it. Add some cross training to it. Do it gradually. Support with things that will help your injury resistance, like strength training, strides, mechanical work, etc. But we can't escape the fact that, as Frank Shorter told us many years ago, the key to training is 2 hard workouts, a long run, and then accumulate as much volume as you can handle for months and years on end. For all of us, that's going to be different. That doesn't mean 100 miles a week is the magic. There is no magic in that number. But we know to optimize performance at our highest level, we need to build up to decent volume. Obviously, if you're a younger athlete, you shouldn't get there quickly. Don't go there until you need to go there. But a gradual, sustainable increase in volume from year to year till we get to a relatively high amount is foundational for basically everyone from 1500 all the way up to marathon and ultra marathon. Now, the good news, the last thing I'll leave you with is after you've been doing it for years, you can actually come back down a little bit, right? If you've built up to 80, 90, 100 miles a week, 110 miles a week, you get to come back down and you'll sustain the adaptations for the volume. So the world-class former world record holder steeplechaser Shaheen was a great example of this. In his training, you looked up over 4 or 5 years, he built up to high volume and then came down for the next 2 or 3 years, where instead of, I forget the exact numbers, instead of 100 miles a week, he's, consistent in the 85 miles a week, which allows him to sustain the adaptations and then shift the emphasis elsewhere to get a little bit more boost. So these are the details we're playing with. But the bottom line is we gotta have that long-term aerobic adaptation if you care about performance. Again, life constraints get in the way, totally understand. But often, just as I was told when I was a high school runner, freshman coming in by my coach, when he said, "Hey, Steve, you want to get better?" I said, "Yep." He said, "Well, guess what? You got to run on weekends and days when we don't have official practice." Volume increase is the simplest and straightforward way to improve long-term performance. Again, there is a point of diminishing return, but many people and most people don't hit that actual point. So look at ways for how you can increase volume sustainably. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed these. Subscribe, check them out. If you haven't yet, check out my new book, Win the Inside Game. It comes out soon. If you order now, you get my 120 page, I think it is, ebook on the elements and philosophy of coaching, which goes through my entire philosophy of coaching in addition. So order now, you get 2 books. This great one on the mental side, my other book that I've never released before, it's not even for sale, on coaching philosophy and training, and you won't regret it. So check those out. Thanks for listening. Till next time, everybody, take care.